Yes, hello to you all once again. Welcome back to the home of old school dirt bikes. Welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, and I hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old school Twinshock and vintage race bikes. Now, just a little heads up before we get into our next video. Now, we've just recently made another visit to the Terry Pickering Classic dirt bike collection, and we've picked out a few nice examples from Terry's collection to show you here on CDB TV in the coming weeks and months throughout the winter period. So make sure that you either subscribe or retune to take a look at those. Right, so we're going to get into our next video now. Now, this is a nice CZ Czechoslovakian twin shocker that I came across just recently, and this is a 1976 CZ 400 belonging to Scottish racer John Porteous. So let's dive right into the video and take a look. Okay, so this next feature bike that we're going to take a look at is Scottish rider John Porteous's quite nice looking 1976 400 CZ, or CZ if you're watching this video in the USA. Although just before we get down to taking a look at some of the parts that are fitted onto this bike, we'll try and bring you a brief history of its past, which all really begins in sunny California in the USA, where this bike was originally built by a man called Mike Lapagalia, who it's said put this machine together for this man here, who is of course Jiří Stolduka from the Czech Republic. And it was Jiří who rode this bike at the 2017 CZ World Championships at Hangtown National Circuit, and he achieved some quite good results while he was riding it, and he secured a third place finish overall on that day, which is all the more remarkable when you consider that Jiří was 69 years old at the time. And in this shot here you can see a picture of the bike prior to it being raced by Jiří while it was still in the United States. Anyhow, it was not long after that particular event it was completed that the bike was then put up for sale, and then consequently bought by Northern Ireland's rider and CZ fanatic Trevor Calderwood, where he then arranged to have the bike shipped over to Southampton in the UK, where he'd then take possession. So Trevor continued to own the bike as part of his dirt bike collection, and sometime later he loaned the machine out to a local Irish rider called Jeff Shaw, who raced it for a few seasons before Trevor then decided to move the bike on when it was subsequently then bought by its current owner, John Porteous. And as we start to get into the bike's parts, beginning with the machine's chassis, which of course isn't an original CZ frame, but an actual replica of the 1976 factory original. And the chassis was built by the very talented hands of Mike Lapagalia, who, as I just mentioned, put the bike together for the aforementioned Jiří Stolduka. Now, I don't know if this chassis is an actual carbon copy of the 1976 design, or if it's been modified in any way, because I was never actually given that information at the time of taking these photos and video clips. But it looks like it's pretty stock, with no modifications that I can see at first glance. Although one of the first things that you do notice on this 1976 chassis is that Mike Lapagalia's not fitted the original narrow footrests that usually came with these frames back in 1976, and you can see that he's substituted those very skinny items for these much wider and much stronger footrests, which will offer the rider a lot more support for his feet while he's putting his full weight onto the bike. And you can also see that the chosen colour scheme is not your stock standard black that usually accompanied most of the CZ bikes of the 1970s. So I'm assuming that this metallic blue colour will have been just to give the bike a slightly different look to the run-of-the-mill black frames that left CZ HQ back in the day. And the power plant that's sitting inside our blue chassis is a full-blown 400cc two-stroke that's undergone a bit of engine work to upgrade it to a much more modern style reed valve intake using a V-Force 3 reed valve block, because I'm pretty sure that this engine back in 1976 would have been a much simpler piston port affair. And to feed that air and fuel mixture into that reed valve block, it's a fairly modern Japanese Mikuni carburetor, and of course not the troublesome standard G-Koff unit that would have been fitted to this engine at the Czech Republic's factory, because those old G-Koffs, as you're aware, did have a bit of a reputation for flooding and leaking fuel, but these much better engineered Mikunis were far superior in terms of their engineering and build quality, and they had much more scope for applying different jet settings and for tuning as well. So looking at this left-hand side casing, you can see that part of the original CZ casings being substituted for this new CNC machined replacement manufactured by L&B Concepts, which are two Scottish engineers called Callum Loudon and Archie Baird, who made these replacement casings in order that you could then fit this new linkage type setup, which basically eliminates the very long throw that you used to experience when changing gear on these Czech racers. And by fitting this brand new casing and bolting on the linkage system, these engines can now change gear as slick and as smooth as any of its Japanese equivalent counterparts. And just in case you're interested, Peter Gerard is also now making a similar shifting system for these bikes without the need for fitting the new style casing. It just simply bolts onto the bike's original factory casing using longer bolts, but it's a system that certainly works very well and is very reliable. And again, you can see that this engine's not undergone the now familiar cylinder and head fin removal, whereby every second cylinder fin is machined off, which I expect was just to remove excess weight from the engine, although I can certainly see some other benefits by not allowing mud, etc., sticking in between the fins if it's a particular sticky race event, which of course could lead to the engine overheating. So fin removal does have its benefits, I expect. But anyone who knows or even rides these big bore two-stroke CZs will know straight away just how big and powerful these engines are. Okay, sometimes they can maybe sound like a load of washers rattling about inside a can when the engine's running, but when it came to producing power, then these quite antiquated engines could certainly pack a punch. And with this engine here being the bigger 400, it'll have no shortage of horsepower whenever it's required. But by now you've probably already sussed out that our particular 76 CZ has had a replacement big bore exhaust system fitted, and I'm pretty sure that for 1976 it was just a one-piece part that the CZ factory bolted onto this bike. But as with all of these 70s Czech machines, you virtually never ever see them with their original pipes still in place. And on our bike here, it's no different with this two-piece header pipe and expansion chamber from PFR, or Pro Form Racing, if you want to give it its full title. And as you can see on this part of the pipe, you can see that it's already had some repairs with this brazing to hold that support bracket in place, which really is quite a common source of exhausts coming off these bikes when you're battering these low-slung exhausts across the racetrack. So these exhaust systems, because they were slung underneath the engine, did tend to take no end of punishment, especially if the track was deep mud and badly rutted. But as we make our way onto the front end of our CZ 400, you'd be excused for thinking that these front forks were actually a pair of Italian Marzocchi units, because to be fair, they do look almost identical to those Italian items, but in actual fact these are Italian Serianis, surprisingly, and even I thought that these were Marzocchis when I first set eyes on them. And as you can see, they do look the part, and certainly strong enough to cope with anything that this big 400 would come across, although there was very little in the way of being able to tune or make adjustments to the rebound or damping on these forks. As far as I know, there wasn't even a facility to add or remove low pressure air into the forks to make them harder or softer. But you have to remember that this was still the mid 1970s, so this is what riders had to work with at that particular time. But while we're here at the front end of the bike, it still has its 1976 drum brakes and hubs, which, as I recall, even for that mid-1970s era, these brakes were pretty good stoppers for an old drum and shoe arrangement, which is why that when you see other hybrid built motocrossers with various different bike parts bolted onto them, you'll notice that quite a lot of them do tend to navigate to these CZ brakes, mainly because these parts are readily available, and they certainly did do a good job of stopping the bike whenever these were required. And again, you can see that this front brake was cable operated, and that brake anchor in between the Seriani forks and the CZ hub, it looks like it's been a homemade item and not the factory original. But to secure those forks onto the chassis, it was a nice pair of billet CNC machined alloy yokes or triple clamps that have been fitted to our CZ. And these very high quality items we've replaced the Czechoslovakian originals that were fitted to this bike in 1976. And once again, this is a quite common swap on these race bikes, which I'm sure is done purely to reduce excess weight, but it also has the added bonus of adding a bit of bling to the bike as well. Now, also here at the back of the bike, the stock CZ rear hub is still in its place, and both the front and this rear braking hub have been mated to a pair of alloy XL wheel rims, which again are not the original items that CZ bolted onto this bike in that year. And on this side of the rear hub, you've got the steel rod that pulls on the brake operating arm, and both the brake's rear torque arm at the bottom and the hub's alloy brake backplate are both upgraded items and slightly different again from the Czechoslovakian stock parts. But one of the more easily recognisable changes that's on our Jerry Stradulka race bike is this quite substantial alloy swing arm, which replaces what would have been a tubular steel item on this bike in 1976. But as I've mentioned in some of my other videos about bikes that swap their good quality steel swing arms for these much more aesthetically pleasing alloy items, these are certainly without doubt lighter and look better on the bike, but if the machine's constantly being ridden hard and getting major airtime over jumps, etc., it's not unusual for cracks to appear on these alloy items, and even in severe cases breaking altogether. But of course that doesn't happen in every single case, and really it's all down to the rider's own preference if he decides on these softer alloy swing arms or the heavier, and I would say sometimes stronger steel items. Now, when this bike was raced at the Hangtown CZ World Championships in 2017, it had a different pair of rear shocks back then, although when Trevor Calderwood had the bike shipped from the United States, he then removed those piggybacks and fitted this pair of classic Falcons instead, which of course are excellent quality and made right here in the UK. Now, I can certainly vouch for these Falcon classic shocks because I did have a similar pair of these on my old 1984 40 Michael when I raced it back in the day, and I'd always found that these suspension units to be of quite decent quality and quite rugged because they did work very well, although they did have limited scope for making adjustments to the rebound and the damping. But then again, that was all reflected in the price of these shocks, which I think for me back in the early 2000s was around the £200 plus mark, which was still a decent price for quite a good set of motocross suspension units. And with regards this fuel tank, I do remember being told on the day that I grabbed these pictures that this fuel tank wasn't the correct tank for this year of machine, but nevertheless it still looks the part, all nicely made up from alloy, as of course a lot of these early CZ tanks were back in the 1970s, with that alloy coffin shaped tank of the Falter era being the most recognisable. But these quite beautifully sculpted alloy tanks did have a carburetor feed on either side of the fuel tank, which I think was to increase the fuel flow to the carburetor and also ensure even distribution of gas, just in case fuel got trapped on one side of the tank, which was quite a common problem on some of the early CZs that had a separation section inside the tank to accommodate the backbone of the bike's chassis. And here on the top of the fuel tank, fuel was filled, of course, through this plastic fuel cap, and just in front of that we have the fuel tank breather pipe, just to make sure that we don't have any kind of airlocks that would stop that precious fuel flowing to the 400cc two-stroke engine. And to secure the fuel tank onto the chassis, it was just a simple push-in rubber mount here at the front, and then a simple long bolt at the back, which meant that you could remove the tank in just a few seconds if you needed to perform any kind of emergency maintenance in between races. But as we move on to the bike's seat, you can see that these old CZs did have quite a generous amount of padding on their seats, which were always a trademark of these Czech Republic race bikes. And I think it was just to make up for the lack of suspension movements at the back of the bikes that these vintage bikes had at the rear. So every little inch of extra padding would go a long way to prevent the rider's crown jewels from being battered to a pulp if it was a particularly bumpy track. But these old CZ seats always seem to have this lower skirt that dropped down from the bottom of the seat, which I'm not entirely sure is what its actual purpose was, but maybe if you're an expert on these old Czechoslovakian racers and these seats in particular, then maybe you can add a comment in the appropriate section at the bottom of your YouTube player. But as we move on into the bike's pilot seat, you can see that the original CZ handlebars are not fitted to this bike, and it's a set of much more modern rentals that are bolted on to the alloy yokes instead. Because if this had been the original 1970s CZ handlebars, then of course they would have had the crossbar welded on and not bolted as we have here with these rentals. And that's another good way to check that you have the stock CZ items when you see that welded crossbar on the handlebars. Now both the clutch and this front brake lever are proper Magura items, which also have their original rubber Magura covers all still intact. And the CZ engine's speed control throttle gasser is another quality item from Foxy Race Products, who actually specialise in making controls for speedway and grass track bikes. But of course these kind of items are still perfectly suited for these classic motocrossers as well. And once again, both of the handlebar grips are supplied from 798 cross, and these are wired very tightly to the bars to stop them slipping in wet conditions. And for more super safety, that all important engine kill switch buttons been added just to make sure that the 400 motor can be shut down as soon as possible should something serious happen to that very precious CZ engine. Now, with regards all of the plastic fenders on the front and rear of our CZ racer. I'm not even sure that this bike would have had plastic fenders back in '76. More than likely it would have been much more nicely polished alloy parts for that period. But of course these plastic items are much lighter, and they can take much more punishment, and are certainly cheaper to produce than their metal counterparts. And at the end of the day, they're a much more practical option to use on one of these off-road motocross machines. So again, this is another quite nice looking classic from back in the day, but as I said, it's not a fully blown original bike from its era, but who actually cares, because as I said, this bike here was built for one of the great Czechoslovakian racers to compete at the 2017 Hangtown CZ World Championships, and the bike certainly served its purpose by bringing its rider Jiří Stadulka to a third place finish overall. So a big well done to Jiří, and not forgetting of course Mike Lapagalia, who actually put the bike together in the first place. And the bike's current owner, John Porteous, has already had his first race event on this new bike, and he said his first impressions are quite good, because he said it did have bags of power and handled superbly, and he said he's already looking forward to next season so that he can get a full year of racing this bike come 2025. So from the very sunny and warm climate of California in the USA to what is now a cold, damp and fog-bound racetrack here at Slamanen near Falkirk, our vintage CZ has certainly crossed the globe and to begin a brand new chapter with its new owner, John Porteous. But coming up here on my CDB TV channel, we'll be taking a look at these lovely two Italian thoroughbreds that I spotted recently, a pair of late 1980s 125 two-stroke Kajivas, which would be quite rare enough to see one of these bikes still racing, but to see two in the one place at the one time is basically unheard of. So we'll be taking a look into James and Stuart Newby's 125 Kajivas in my next video posting. So until the next time, keep watching, and we'll all speak again very soon when we return to Classic Dirt Bike TV.